So, so it might be, I don't know, it might be slightly confusing to have named it as such, but we're kind of stuck with it now. And this theory or framework was founded by me and Dan Siddiqui at Carleton University, but the LrFG research group now includes a lot of international collaborators and also people in the States and Canada who aren't international to us, including Oleg of your very institution. And I also want to say thanks for letting me speak to your institution, which is a very august one and an important university in Europe. So let me tell you a little bit about this theory, just in broad brushstrokes. So LrFG seeks to develop a formal and theoretical framework that couples, like Oleg said, the constraint-based approach to syntax of lexical-functional grammar with the realizational morpheme-based approach to word formation of distributed morphology. So I'm an LFGer, Dan is a distributed morphology person, we're friends and colleagues, we were colleagues for a number of years, and so we decided, well, let's try to make something of this, and partly we conceive of this as a bridge building exercise between communities that maybe don't talk to each other enough, in our opinion. Now, of course, this synthesis may seem superficially sort of quixotic, but it has surprising strengths. So LrFG inherits a robust approach to polysynthesis from distributed morphology. It inherits a robust approach to non-configurationality from LFG. And also it offers a version of DM that promises more coherence since it is constraints all the way down, as which is the title of one of our LrFG papers, in contrast to standard DM approaches, which assume a derivational approach to syntax, typically some version of minimalism, coupled with a constraint-based approach to form, typically some version of optimality theory. Okay. So the goals of this talk are as follows. So the basic aim is to give a full explanation of the following diagram, which schematizes the LrFG exponents function, which following convention in LFG, we use a Greek letter that looks a bit like the name of the structure or something like that. So this is actually the Greek letter nu, but we call it the V mapping. Okay. Oh, and there's already an error here. This should be nu, not actually little v. So the left-hand side of the exponents function is a bundle of information, which we call the exponendum, split into a part about distribution and a part about function/meaning. Okay. The right-hand side of the exponents function is another bundle of information, the exponent, represented as a feature structure called a vocabulary structure. Along the way, I'll provide aspects of LrFG analyses of English, Spanish, and Ojibwe, and I'm going to try to answer the following questions, or at least some of them, or some aspects of them. Why should exponenda be represented as tuples that separate distribution and function/meaning? What kind of information is necessary in exponents? And what is the relationship between morphological exponents and phonological realization? Now, as revealed by the Stumpian classification, where this kind of theory is called lexical-realizational, arguably in the literature, there isn't really a careful distinction drawn between exponents and realization. But part of what I want to try to convince you of today is that these should not be thought of as sort of interchangeable terms. They're about different parts of the grammar. Okay, so I want to give you some background on the theory first, and just sort of a way of getting a foothold in where I'm going next. So first I'm going to talk about LrFG and distributed morphology, and then I'm going to talk about LrFG and LFG. So as many of you probably know, DM is a framework for morphological theory, and like any morphological framework, it assumes an interface with a syntactic module. However, unlike other realizational models of morphology, DM has always assumed a particular syntactic framework for providing those structures, which we can think of as standard Chomskyan syntax, here called minimalism for short, even though DM predates minimalism strictly construed. So given this consistent co-occurrence, it can be hard to easily identify where minimalism ends and where DM begins. So for example, the Y model is a feature of minimalism that DM inherits, the model that has, you know, a spell out and then a split into PF and LF, as is the fact that the consequences of operations such as head movement live in the PF branch of that Y. So since we're not adopting minimalist syntax, we need to ask ourselves, what's the essence of DM without minimalist or minimalist-like assumptions about syntax. And we think the essence can be captured in 6 properties. So the first is obviously that DM is committed to morpheme-based morphosyntactic. That's actually what the that's actually what the kind of lexical and Stump's Lexical-Realizational is trying to pick out. So in a morpheme-based model of morphology, complex words have internal structure. I'm going to set aside here the completely confusing use of morpheme in the DM literature and adopt the standard definition of the morphemic hypothesis. And secondly, morphology is often strictly concatenative. So this means that words are not atomic in DM, and things like paradigms and other realizational frameworks, such as Stump's paradigm function morphology, are epiphenomenal in DM. So Stump 2001 calls this property of morphological theories lexical, and parsimony dictates that there should not be 2 structure building modules, morphology and syntax, if a theory can achieve the same explanatory power with just one. So this property of DM is often called syntax all the way down in the DM literature. So after morpheme-based morphosyntax, we have the important property of realization. So a realizational model of morphology assumes that morphology expresses information rather than adding information. In contrast, incremental approaches, using Stump's opposition again to morphology, assume that morphology is information adding. So realizational approaches typically assume bundles of features as the input to morphological operations. The DM literature uniquely calls this property late insertion, but in reality, most contemporary models of morphology are realizational. Note that this property, realization, and the previous property, morpheme-based morphosyntax, are not linked properties. So for example, amorphous morphology, Anderson's theory, and paradigm function morphology are word and paradigm realizational models. In Stump's classifications, such models are inferential realizational. DM is, in contrast, lexical realizational. And just a brief shout out to nanosyntax. It's another lexical realizational model of morphology, which shares certain similarities to distributed morphology, but I'm not going to talk about it any more than this today. Third property, morphology is an interface. So in contemporary DM, the ideal appears to be that morphology is an interface rather than a separative generative component of the grammar. So this is a useful quote from a paper by Bermudez, Otero, and Luis. So morphology has no proprietary categories, but deals only in morphs, understood as pieces of phonological material lexically specified with instructions for their use as exponents of syntactic properties. Okay. So this is most relevant in DM's rejection of the morpheme, the word, and the paradigm. In the DM literature, this property is typically called non-lexicalist because the model of syntax that results from an interface with DM has been taken to necessarily reject the lexicalist hypothesis or lexical integrity hypothesis, which is often traced back to Chomsky, 1970. Now we'll see that there's actually a bit of a subtlety here when we get to exploring lexicalism a bit later on in the talk. But it's also worth a moment to acknowledge that this is not a settled view of DM. So for example, in Halley and Morant's 1993, there's something called M structure, which clearly had proprietary rules. Indeed, a view of DM in the literature today is that the post-spell-out PF branch rules, such as local dislocation, rebracketing, impoverishment, fusion, fission, enrichment, and readjustment, none of which LrFG has, constitute a morphological component of the grammar, i.e. a lexicon. However, it's very important for the present discussion that all these operations serve to address syntax morphology mismatches. That's basically the insight that they're trying to get at. So we assume here that such mechanisms are not properties of DM per se, but rather are specifically properties of the DM minimalism interface, which is why they're typically referred to as PF operations. Okay. So that's part of the reason why our version of DM, LrFG, is not going to have these operations. Perhaps the most distinguishing feature of distributed morphology is something that Dan, my colleague, calls 3 lists, which is maybe not that descriptive, but gets to the heart of the matter. So maybe the most salient feature of DM is that it gave up on the claims that syntactic, semantic, and phonological domains of word or morpheme align on the same domain. as famously discussed by Morantz in a 1997 paper. Indeed, distributed morphology gets its name from this property, namely the fact that these properties of morphology are distributed in 3 different domains. So it created 3 distinct lists, one for each domain. The vocabulary is the list for phonological properties. The encyclopedia is the list for semantic properties. And the 3rd list is frustratingly without an agreed upon name in the literature. I don't know, you can call it the syntacticon or something. Its members are the formal features that populate syntactic structures. These are the things called morphemes by some practitioners of DM. Okay. Now, as you'll see shortly in LrFG, we don't really, we have these different domains, but they're not really split up in exactly this split. Okay. 5th, an important property, which is also linked to the 6th property of DM, is that it employs a common type of linguistic rule, which is typically called the elsewhere principle, also called the Paninian principle, which is basically that more specific rules block more general rules, right? So the classic view of the elsewhere condition is seen in Aronoff. A morphological rule with more specific conditions is applied before a general rule and obviously bleeds the more general rule. So this has long been the main means through which irregular rules block the application of regular rules, for example. In contemporary realizational models, this blocking is achieved through competition, where a more specific form outcompetes a more general form. In the DM literature, the elsewhere principle is standardly called the subset principle in reference to subsets of features. So in other words, if A has a subset of the features of B, B takes precedence because it has more features, it's more specific. Okay? And the last crucial property of DM is underspecification. So a fundamental challenge of any morphological theory is syncretism or polysemy. And this is the simple phenomenon that morphological forms appear in many different environments, often with slightly different meanings. So these are a violation of bi-uniqueness in the sense that you might ideally think a unique form maps to a unique meaning. And there are many ways that morphological models can deal with this, such as rules of referral. DM, like many other models, captures this by assuming that a morphological form underdetermines its syntactic and semantic properties. So in sum, for us, DM without a minimalism interface is precisely the combination of those 6 properties listed here: morpheme-based morphosyntax, realization, morphology as an interface, 3 lists, the elsewhere principle, and underspecification. So crucially, LrFG also has all of these properties. In other words, LrFG is a version of DM, but one which is entirely constraint-based and not based on minimalist syntactic assumptions. Now, the other half of this bizarre marriage is LFG. So now let's talk about LrFG in the context of LFG. And I'm not assuming a lot of familiarity with LFG, but I'm assuming that people know the broad brushstrokes, that syntax is separated into C structure and F structure, for example. C structure representing things like syntactic dominance, constituency, and precedence, whereas F structure represents just about everything else syntacticians are interested in, such as local and unbounded dependencies, local dependencies like agreement and raising, unbounded dependencies like WH movement, things like grammatical functions, obviously, and so on. Case marking, all of these things are in F structure. Now, as many people probably realize, LFG is standardly a lexicalist syntactic theory, and we can characterize the lexicalist hypothesis following Lapointe's UMass thesis as in 2. No syntactic rule can refer to elements of morphological structure. In LFG, this is captured in the lexical integrity principle through formulations like the following. So these are given in chronological order. So Simpson's 1983 definition is: no constituent structure rules may order any element into or out of lexical categories such as N, A, or V. That is, constituent structure rules are blind to the internal structure of lexical categories. The 95 definition by Bresnan and Mchambo: words are built out of different structural elements and by different principles of composition than syntactic phrases. And finally, from the 2nd edition of Bresnan's Lexical-Functional Syntax textbook, Morphologically complete words are leaves of the C structure tree, and each leaf corresponds to one and only one C structure node. So these basically are all getting at the notion that in LFG, in standard LFG, terminal nodes are words, including phonology and whatever syntactic features and semantic information they contribute. So there are three distinct possible general positions on lexicalism, with LFG standardly subscribing to the first, and lexicalist derivational theories such as Chomsky's own theories up to and including the minimalist program subscribing to the second. Distributed morphology subscribes to the third. So strong lexicalism is the view that morphology and syntax are entirely distinct. Inflectional and derivational morphology are captured by a separate morphological component. Weak lexicalism states that inflectional morphology is part of the syntactic component, but derivational morphology is captured by a separate morphological component. And if you think about the genesis of sort of transformational grammar and transformations like affix hopping, where you're trying to get the affix lowered onto the right verb in English, this was a rule in syntactic structures. Clearly, that's a version of weak lexicalism, because if the affix is in the syntax, then the syntax is seeing inflectional morphology, right? And then we have non-lexicalism, which is the claim that inflectional morphology and derivational morphology alike are part of the syntactic component. There is no separate morphological component, okay? So the obvious point of contrast between LrFG and LFG concerns the lexicalist hypothesis in two. So LrFG is a kind of non-lexicalist LFG. Now, this may sound contradictory, but it's important to separate LFG theory, which assumes strong lexicalism, from the LFG formalism used to state the theory. The formalism and formal tools can equally well formalize a non-lexicalist version of LFG, like LrFG. In fact, LrFG even upholds part of LFG's lexical integrity principle if we think about it carefully. The definition of lexical integrity in 5, so this is the one from Bresnan et al. 2016, has two parts. LrFG upholds the part that states that each leaf corresponds to one and only one C structure node. These are not multi-dominance trees that you're going to be seeing. So, you know, these are normal trees, right? However, I'm just going to skip the part about lexical sharing. LrFG rejects the part that states that morphologically complete words are leaves of the C structure tree. The C structure leaves or terminals in LrFG are not morphologically complete words. The C structure leaves terminals are feature bundles that map to form, but the form itself is not part of the terminal node. So, in other words, the form is part of the realizational process. It's not part of the syntactic insertion process, or however you want to think about it. However, notice that the notion morphologically complete word is left unanalyzed in the definition in 5. And in fact, it's far from clear that morphologically complete word is really a coherent notion. This has been talked about extensively in the literature predating distributed morphology, but, you know, morphologically complete word, given the distribution of morphology into 3 domains in distributed morphology, is not a very coherent notion in DM. But I want to convince you that it's kind of not that coherent a notion, DM aside, right? So the essential problem is that there are multiple relevant notions of wordhood, and they don't align on a single type of object that we can point to and unambiguously and confidently call a word. In fact, there can be mismatches between the phonological, syntactic, and semantic aspects of words. So for example, portmanteau words are examples of things that are phonologically simple, but semantically and syntactically complex. So the theory of lexical sharing for LFG, which was formally difficult and was a real insight from Michael Westcott, was really about things like do in French, right? Which is a preposition that's sort of gobbled up an article, right? So do blocks de le in French, right? But you have de la. So it's not that the preposition article combination in general is blocked, but just the masculine one, right? So, you know, the way to say you drink or are drinking milk in French is tu bois du lait, not tu bois de le lait, right? Even as a non-native speaker, my tongue feels bad saying delele. Okay. And then here's an example from English dialect. So there's a lot of English dialects, including Dan's, that have this proximate future first person form called I'ma. Who knows how to spell it? It's really just a spoken form. But I'ma go means I'm about to go. It has like a predictable meaning. It's not just some sort of dialect slurry or something that your English teacher might, slap you on the wrist for saying. Okay, so portmanteau words are an example of things that are phonologically simple, but semantically and syntactically complex. Idiomatic expressions are phonologically and syntactically complex, but not necessarily semantically complex, and never in a way that maps entirely transparently to their phonology and syntax. So for example, English has this intensifier. You can say things like, I read the shit out of this book. And it just means something like, I thoroughly read this book, right? But really, the semantics of the shit out of is just intensifier, even though it's clearly phonologically and syntactically quite complex. Okay? And it's clearly not compositional, of course. Or not, not obviously compositional. Lastly, units of syntax can be phonologically or semantically dependent on their contexts. So for example, here we've got a sort of French obligatory contraction. So je l'ai vu, I saw it. You cannot say je le ai vu or je la ai vu, right? This is obligatory contraction. Or here we have an example with an idiom in English where we see that the cat, to get its idiomatic meaning, has to occur in some favored sense in the context of let out of the bag, right? So if you want to say something like the secret has been spilled, or those are beans, the secret has been revealed, you need to have this let out of the bag come somewhere later in a way that's linked to the cat. So I'm being very vague, but I hope you can see what I'm getting at. So LrFG thus countenances 3 criteria for wordhood, which correlates with the DM criteria, but I think we've sort of just phrased it a bit differently. So the first is a word as an unanalyzed phonological string, a phonological criterion. Second, a word as a lexicalized string with a non-compositional meaning, semantic criterion. Or a word as a syntactic atom, the syntactic criterion. So LrFG just assumes that there's 3 notions of wordhood that sometimes happen to align but can diverge. So there can be mismatches between the 3 types of wordhood. With its focus on mismatches, LrFG is therefore strongly in the spirit of LFG. LFG is all about mismatches between different levels of structures in order to capture things that are often captured derivationally in theories that you might be more familiar with. So LrFG uses the standard co-description mechanism of LFG to simultaneously state the phonological, syntactic, and semantic aspects of formatives. And I'm not going to make a big deal out of this in this talk, but one of the nice things about LrFG is it actually allows you to have morphosemantics without just marking up your syntax. In the Y model, you can't really have morphosemantics because PF and LF don't talk to each other. The only way they talk to each other is through syntax. Okay? There's no direct interface between PF and LF. So here are some possible points of comfort for an LFGer gazing on LrFG's familiar yet alien landscape. So LrFG could be considered to be offering a morphological theory for LFG that had previously been captured by somewhat ad hoc devices like phrase structure rules for word formation. In other words, LFG owes some kind of theory of word structure, which has generally been lacking until recently, and LrFG seeks to pay that debt in a different way from Mary's theories. So the vocabulary items of LrFG, second, contain much the same information as LFG's lexical entries, but without the commitment that morphophonological form is bundled as part of the lexical entry. It should be easy to specify an algorithm for translating LrFG's VI's vocabulary items into LFG lexical entries. Related to the first 2 points, if one were to want to maintain some version of the lexicalist hypothesis, one could view LrFG as offering a microscopic view of the structure of words, used sort of pre-theoretically, in particular major categories like verb and noun. For example, the TP node in 15 below in some sense is the verb, but the LrFG C structure shows its internal structure. Okay. So I'm happy to take a brief breather to let anyone ask clarification questions, or I can push on if that's not the house style. Okay, I'm going to push on.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's get into the details of this new framework. So LrFG is similar to standard LrFG with changes to the C structure and its relationship with morphosyntactic elements. So the terminal nodes of C structures are not words, but instead are exponenda. In other words, for us, distribution, function mapping, function meaning pairs. So recall from one above that the left-hand side of that arrow was this pair, which has a list of categories, possibly just one long, encoding the distribution, and a union of 3 different kinds of information that encode the function and meaning. I'll say more about that shortly. So these C structure terminal nodes are mapped by a correspondence function new to vocabulary structures, or V structures for short. So here's an example from Ojibwe, from a paper that we wrote 3 years ago to demonstrate the basics of an LrFG analysis shown in 16. Note that the exponent V structures are here just abbreviated by their form. So we'll look at the exponents in much more detail later on in the talk. So this is a single word in this polysynthetic Algonquian language, Ojibwe. I mean, single word in some pre-theoretic sense, right? That means they saw us inclusive. So we have this thing here that is a kind of second person marker, which is involved in getting us this us. So in other words, us and you. That's what gets you the inclusive. Yeah. And then we have a past tense marker. We have the root wob here. We have a marker of transitivity. We have a marker of what's called voice in the Algonquinist literature. So this is in the inverse voice. And we have a third plural pronoun as well. So why is this in the inverse voice? Because in Ojibwe, there's an animacy hierarchy. So because participant persons like first person and second person rank higher on this hierarchy in Ojibwe, if you're going to have this kind of inversion where the subject is actually a lower ranked person, you have to mark it in the inverse voice. Okay. And so here's an LrFG structure for this thing. So I don't want to get mired in the details here, but we see that, you know, for an LrFG person, this structure might be kind of alarming, but for somebody who's more used to minimalism or DM, it's not that alarming in the sense that it has categories like T, agger, voice, and so on, right? And of course, we also have roots, right? And for us, one feature of the theory is that we can give a nice theory of what roots are. Roots are things that contribute preds, right? And these things are kind of elusive in normal distributed morphology, but this is like our definition of a root, basically. Now, we don't have to get mired down in the details. If you want to look at the Melchin et al. Paper, which is available on the LrFG website, you can read all about this. We have this exploded person feature here. This is our way of capturing the animacy hierarchy without actually imposing a hierarchy. You can read the paper to find out how. But basically, this is a fairly standard LrFG F structure that arises from a pretty non-standard, from the LrFG perspective, tree, right? This is a single word, right? From a lexicalist perspective. So the C structure for 15 in standard LrFG would look like this. Now, of course, all this information here would also occur under here. So the union of all that information would be there. So, you know, arguably, while 17 is admirably syntactically simple, it's not particularly morphologically illuminating, right? So LrFG's morphological assumptions thus exhibit the typical tension between word-based and morpheme-based morphology. So at a very high level of generalization, from a typological perspective, we could say, well, word-based morphology is attractive for fusional languages and so-called pure morphology, as evinced very well by Indo-European. It seems to be a lot less illuminating for highly agglutinative and especially polysynthetic languages. Okay. Morpheme-based morphology, in contrast, is attractive for agglutinative and polysynthetic languages, right? Going back to Hackett's idea of the morphological ideal, it's basically agglutination, right? But it tends to be less illuminating for fusional languages and often denies that there's even any such thing as pure morphology. So LFG theory's assumption of strong lexicalism has pushed it towards a word-based realizational theory of morphology, such as paradigm function morphology, Stump's theory. Instead, LrFG uses LFG's formal tools to build a morpheme-based theory of morphology, as in DM. So the grammatical architecture of LrFG looks like this. So you see that the origin point in the architecture is constituent structure, and then there's basically two paths through the architecture. One is about form, the upper path, and one is about meaning, the lower path. Okay? The upper path has this V mapping to vocabulary structure, which is then P mapped or rho mapped to prosodic structure, which is then O mapped to the phonological string, and that's your final form. On the lower path, we map constituent structure via the standard LFG projection or correspondence function phi to functional structure. Again, as a standard in glue semantics for LFG, functional structure is mapped to semantic structure by the sigma projection function. And following work by Mary Dalrymple and Irina Nikolaeva, semantic structure is mapped by this iota mapping to information structure. So notice that in LrFG, although we haven't worked on information structure very much, this can be part of the information that something is expressing. So what's the difference between an English contracted form like as in I'm, and a non-contracted form like am? Well, am is obligatory when you're focusing, for example. You can't focus the contraction. And that's an information structural notion. Okay. So the output of the grammar, this pairing of form and meaning for any particular set of input formatives, is a form-meaning pair where the form incorporates prosody, still fed by constituent structure, as in other approaches to the syntax prosody mapping in LFG. And the meaning incorporates information structure, still fed by semantic structure, as in other approaches to information structure in LFG. The relationship between terminal nodes and VIs, so now we're talking about the V mapping, is many to one, using the mechanism of spanning. So in other words, one VI may realize features of multiple terminal nodes. The result is similar to the lexical sharing model proposed for LFG by Westcott, but maintains the complex internal structures of words as part of syntax. The whole point of lexical sharing is to have strong lexicalism so that you don't kind of put the morphology in the syntax. But we do want to put the morphology in the syntax, so we're not doing it the same way. So lastly, it should be mentioned that LrFG is not the only realizational approach to morphology in LFG. So I already mentioned Mary's work, but the realizational framework of Spencer 2013 was designed with constraint-based theories like LFG in mind. Paradigm function morphology by Stump has been used to as a realizational framework for morphology by people like Sadler and Nordlinger, Dalrymple, and Amanda Thomas, among others in LFG. However, a key distinction between LrFG and these proposals is that LrFG does not posit a separate class of morphological features for exponents, instead assuming that exponents is sensitive to regular syntactic features, compositional semantics, and information structure. So positing an additional strictly morphological class of features generally results in a lot of redundancy, which is to be avoided if possible for reasons of theoretical elegance. So now the main point of the talk is to talk about exponents in LrFG. Now, the theory of exponents, and the English phonology does me no favor here. The theory of exponents with a C is ultimately a theory of exponents with an S. So for me, these two words sound the same. So the theory of exponents is a theory of exponents. I don't know if I managed to get the T out. So an exponent is a morphological representation that serves as the interface between an exponendum and a phonological realization. In LrFG, an exponent is represented as a vocabulary structure, or V structure for short. The vocabulary in LrFG is the mapping from the set of exponenda, the set of left-hand sides of vocabulary items, to the set of exponents, the set of right-hand sides of vocabulary items. In other words, the set of V structures. So in other words, the vocabulary in LrFG is nothing more or less than a set of vocabulary items, a set of pairs of exponenda and exponents. Okay? A vocabulary item is represented as in one above, repeated here, and the tuple in one, so by tuple, I mean just the thing on the left-hand side, right? Because the thing on the right-hand side isn't a pair, it's a structure. So the tuple in one is the representation of an exponendum. It is mapped by nu or v, the exponents function, from exponenda to exponents to its exponent, represented as a vocabulary structure. So now the rest of the talk is telling you about what this stuff is and how it works. Okay. So first, let's turn to the distribution coordinates. So the first member of an exponendum pair is a list of categories which represent some part of the terminal yield of an LrFG C structure. So the first member of the pair encodes the vocabulary item syntactic distribution. So as I mentioned above, LrFG assumes the morphosyntactic operation of spanning, and spans are a list of C structure categories that are involved in many-to-one cases of exponents in which a single V structure expones multiple C structure nodes. So this is why the distribution coordinate in vocabulary items is a list rather than a single category. And there are two kinds of spanning in LrFG. There's vocabulary spanning, which is the case where the category list in the first coordinate of an exponendum has length greater than 1. So in other words, vocabulary spanning is a matter of listing in the vocabulary. Okay? And then we have Pac-Man spanning, the case where some category would be left unexponed and is instead mapped to a neighboring exponent. We're going to see an example later. In other words, Pac-Man spanning is a matter of the V mapping between being a total function from the domain of C structure nodes to the codomain of V structures. Okay, that's kind of a formal way of saying it's how we avoid empty categories. So there are no empty categories in LrFG because we have these spanning operations instead. So as a result of the two kinds of spanning, this function V, the exponents function, must be a many-to-one function. But that's okay. The C structure to F structure mapping function is also a many-to-one function, as we already implicitly saw, right? So for example, both the S node and the TP node, and in fact, everything on this whole path, anything where you see an up arrow, up equals down, sorry, this is all mapping to this same F structure. So all of these many C structure nodes are mapping to the same F structure. In other words, the phi mapping from constituent structure to functional structure has always been many-to-one mapping. Okay, so back to distribution. Actually, no, that finished distribution. So now let's talk about function meaning. The second member of the pair on the left-hand side of the abstract vocabulary item in one is the union of a set of descriptions of F structure, F, a set of descriptions of S structures and glue semantics meaning constructors, G, and a set of descriptions of I structures, information structures, I. Any of these sets may be empty, and this union represents the function meaning of the vocabulary item. So some things don't really have a meaning. Like, so for example, in our analysis of morphosemantics, we talked about the word divineness in our 2022 LFG proceedings paper. Ness is just a nominalizer. It just takes an adjective and changes its category. It doesn't really add any meaning. Okay, so there's not much going on in the right-hand coordinate. It's just adding the category N to the distribution. So in order to make it easier to refer to this union of F, G, and I, we call it a fugui. Why do we call it a fugui? Because that's what it looks like. Fugui. Okay. So now let's talk about exponents, vocabulary structures. So turning now to the output or right-hand side of the V mapping in one, we have a vocabulary structure. A V structure is modeled as an attribute value matrix similarly to F structures. Attributes are symbols, like dependence. Values are symbols, strings, V structures, or sets of symbols. If something is a singleton set, we'll often drop the set brackets just for to avoid notational clutter. So on analogy with F structures and F descriptions, V structures are described by V descriptions, a set of defining equations and constraints that picks out the minimal satisfying V structure, if any, as its model. We'll see an example of that later on in the talk. So this is the general form of an exponent or V structure in LrFG. So we have these features: phonological representation, or phonrep for short, that's represented as a string, and it encodes the phonological realization and conditions that apply to it. We have P frame or prosodic frame, which is a prosodic unit, and we represent this as a string wrapped around the prosodic correspondent of whatever this V structure is. Prosodic domain is another prosodic unit that's a string modeled as a string wrapped around the value of P frame. This will become more obvious when we look at a concrete example. And dependence is just the set left-right, which is encoding the direction of dependency. Class is encoding inflectional classes. And the host feature is important to us. It's encoding the host if there is one. Host introduces this new feature, ident or identity, which can only have the feature plus, and it's a symbol. And otherwise, it can have the other sort of features that we see in general V structures like phonrep, P frame, dep, and class. So the general form of a vocabulary item in LrFG, now sort of what I've done here is the previous diagram in one, I've now made the right-hand side explicit. That's all I've done. Okay, looks like this. Okay, so the following example shows the vocabulary item for the English N suffix that is a deadjectivizing verbalizer. So this would be in words like blacken or soften, right? So its category is just a V sub A, and it has this complex semantics, which means cause to become whatever the property is. So blacken means to cause to become black. Soften means to cause to become soft, and so on. And then it has this very specific kind of V structure, which I'm going to go through systematically next. Okay. Notice that the function meaning coordinate of the exponendum, so in other words, all this stuff, is a single glue semantics meaning constructor that encodes its meaning. There's no F structural or structural information to express, and the semantics is going to be fleshed out shortly in a big diagram. That is the reason the talk is called what it is. Okay. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can ask me about them in question time if you want. But the first bunch of features in a V structure concerns the phonology and prosody of the exponent. So the feature phonrep, oops, it should be there. The feature phonrep or phonological representation encodes the exponent's underlying phonological representation and any conditions it places on its phonological context. The feature prosodic frame specifies any conditions the exponent places on its prosodic context, and the feature prosodic domain encodes the prosodic level at which the exponent prosodifies, i.e. it is integrated into the surrounding prosodic environment. The feature dependence encodes the direction of prosodic dependence of the exponent. Okay. So what's phonological representation good for? Well, it allows aspects of the phonology to be underspecified. For example, much of English inflection is probably underspecified for plus minus voice. And the value can also encode a memorized or conditioned list. So for example, the English indefinite determiners a or an are listed phonologically conditioned allomorphs. What about prosodic frame? P frame takes as its value a string wrapped around the prosodic correspondent of the V structure. So the value encodes any conditions that the exponent places on its mapping to prosody. In other words, its prosodic context. So for example, excuse my French, fuck insertion in English is sensitive to foot structure. So you can say things like abso-fucking-lutely, but not, and it's going to be hard for me to even say this, ab-fucking-solutely. Okay. Similarly, in fixation in Austronesian is sensitive to syllable structure. So again, it has a prosodic condition. Okay, what about P domain or prosodic domain? Well, it takes a value as a string wrapped around the thing's P frame. The value specifies in which prosodic domain the V structure's prosodic correspondent is integrated into prosody according to some definition of prosodic phrasing at P structure, prosodic structure. For example, using this small dot to represent the prosodic correspondent of the V structure in question, English geminates can only appear at P domain intonational phrase, i.e. above the level of the prosodic word. Okay, English has no word internal geminates. Similarly, some Germanic prefixes are metrical, while others are extrametrical. The prosodic domain account for the different stress and phonotactic restrictions on affixation promises a viable analysis of German prefixes. So those whose P domain is the word are stressed. So for example, this word meaning very old in German is pronounced uralten, not uralten. In contrast, German prefixes whose domain are the intonational phrase are unstressed. They're extrametrical. So we have gealtert, not gealtert, right? So what about dependence? Well, it takes a set of symbols of its values and they encode the direction of the prosodic dependency. Left for suffixes and left-leaning clitics, right for prefixes and right-leaning clitics, or both for infixes and mesoclitics. Okay. Now let's turn to the morphosyntactic features, which I want to talk about. One of these, the host feature, in some detail. So the second lot of features concerns the morphosyntax of the exponent. The feature class encodes purely morphological distinctions, such as inflectional class. So notice that LrFG is not allergic to capturing things like declension and conjugation, and this is how we do it, right? Regular distributed morphology kind of wants to wish this stuff away, but I don't think that's actually a completely responsible attitude towards morphology. Okay. The feature host plays an important role in our theory of affix exponents and realization. So this feature relates the V structure of an affix directly to the V structure of its host or stem. This direct relationship between affixes and hosts allows us to very locally encode effects that in other DM frameworks are modeled by derivational operations such as head movement or lowering, which are operationalizations of morphological merger. Okay. So I think I've said enough about class for now. Let's talk about host. So something that any theory of morphology needs to capture is that affixes are phonologically and morphosyntactically conditioned. In LrFG, we conceive of this conditioning as the affix constraining the possible hosts with which it can co-occur. This is accomplished through the host feature in V structure, which encodes the relationship between an affix and its host non-derivationally through a kind of modified equality. In other words, the value of the host of the V structure exponent of an affix is itself another exponent V structure. Most of the features in host are features that we've already encountered, but host can also be specified for the identity feature, which is either present with the value plus or not present at all. So thus, ident is effectively privative. Note that the host feature cannot contain host. This is captured by the principle of local host identification in 33 below, which uses the restriction operator to ensure that when a host is identified, it brings with it all of its features except host if it has one. So in other words, the LHI ensures that an exponent can include information about its host, but not about its host, never mind its hosts, and so on. Okay. So the effects of morphological feature are controlled by this ident plus feature in host. Other than this feature, a host can be specified by an affix to have any of the V structure features except host itself. So we assume that the the prosodic mapping from V structure to prosodic structure is sensitive to the host feature. So if a V structure alpha has a host V structure beta, then beta's realization in P structure must be prosodified in the P domain of alpha's realization. This is captured by the principle of host mapping. So for all V structures, if V prime is the host of V, then the prosodic domain of V prime must be part of the prosodic domain of V. Okay, now what about identity? This is doing a lot of heavy lifting in our theory, so we need to dig into it a little bit. So it just takes a symbol as a value, and it's constrained to be the symbol plus. So the feature is either present as ident plus or not present at all, so it's a privative feature. The ident feature captures locality conditions on the C structural and F structural context of the host. If identity plus is present in the host, then the exponent in question constrains the identity of its host as follows. This is just the intuition. There's a more formal representation below. So host identification. Given beta, a V structure containing the feature host ident plus, and eta, a C structure terminal node that maps to a vocabulary item that beta expones. Oops, this shouldn't have crept into this version of the talk, apologies. Beta's host is the V structure that expones the closest C structure terminal node to eta that maps to the same F structure as eta. So closest is defined as follows in general. So Y is the closest C structure node to X if and only if X C commands Y, and there's no Z such that X C commands Z and Z C commands Y. So there's no intervening C commander of Y that X C commands. Okay. So the representations in 27 to 30 sketch two situations in which ident plus is satisfied and two in which it is not. Notice that in all cases, eta is a C structure node that corresponds to beta. Again, this shouldn't have crept in. We abbreviate this as V of eta equals beta. So in 27, we see that ident plus is satisfied. So if we look at this node, eta prime, that maps to beta's host, it's the closest C structure node to N that maps to the same F structure as N, right? We capture the mapping, so we say that, so this down arrow is, sorry, I said N both times, but I meant eta. So this down arrow is referring to the F structure correspondent of eta, and let's just label that F. And then this equation is stating that that's the same F structure correspondent for eta prime. Okay. And this thing is the beta in question, and this is beta's hosts. And they're in the right local relationship, and they share an F structure. So it's all good. In 28, ident plus is satisfied. So even though there's a closer node, Z here, from the perspective of just the C structure alone, we've stated that Z in this configuration does not map to the same F structure as eta and eta prime. So what this effectively means is that things that have other grammatical functions like subject, object, or famously adjuncts don't get in the way of this affix lowering to its host. This is a pernicious problem in standard DN. How do you get around specifiers? Okay. Now let's look at 29 and 30 in which ident plus is not satisfied. So why isn't it satisfied here? Well, because although eta prime is the closest node to eta from a C structural perspective, they don't map to the same F structure. Okay. And in the second case, here we have a closer node, call it eta double prime, which does map to the same F structure. So therefore, this thing must be the host, not this lower thing. Okay. Okay, so we can use the term F domain, which is sometimes used in a different sense in the LFG literature. So maybe we should think of a different word for it. For the set of C structure nodes that map to the same F structure with some C structure node alpha. So we define a function to yield the node's F domain. So for all C, I don't want to read through the function, but basically this gives you all the nodes that map to the same F structure as the thing you're concerned about. Note that F domain ensures that a node is in its own F domain since equality is a reflexive relation. For example, F domain of big V using the category label to stand in for the node in a typical LFG analysis would include nodes labeled V, V prime, VP, I prime, IP, C, C prime, CP. So in other words, what is often known as the verbal spine, right? Since the function is reflexive, the minimal F domain for any C structure node that's phi mapped is a singleton set containing the node itself. Only a C structure node that's not mapped to F structure can have an empty F domain. Okay. We also define a function to calculate the closest C structure terminal to a node based on the informal definition in 26 above and an assumed standard definition of C command. So C command is typically defined in terms of dominance, and dominance is often construed to be a reflexive relation, so a node dominates itself. We explicitly exclude the case where a node reflexively satisfies closest, because and then every node would always be the closest node to itself, right? Which is not a very illuminating notion of closest. Okay, so for all C structure nodes, blah, 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 we get this closest thing. Never mind exactly how it works, but all of this together gives us the principle of local host identification, which says that if something is marked as ident plus, right, then the closest node has to be part of the same F domain, and the host equals that thing, but minus its host. So the way to read this is this V structure except for this feature. So this is the restriction operator, the backslash, which states that the V mapping of n's host is the V structure Vn prime, except for any host information that Vn prime may contain. So that means that you can talk about your host, but you can't talk about its host or anything further, any of those relations. So it's very, very local. Okay. Sorry, there's a small error here. This should have the path. It should say host here. So note that this also allows us to capture the notion of bound stems, as in Spanish, right? So the stem for talk in Spanish is hablo, but it never occurs alone, right? So a bound stem is a vocabulary item whose left-hand side contains a root and whose right-hand side is listed as ident plus. That is, there are two ways for ident plus to be marked on a V structure: by being specified as such on the right-hand side of a vocabulary item, i.e. by being listed in the vocabulary, such as for the root hablo in Spanish, or by the V structure being the host for some affix. So as a consequence, exponents or the V mapping can be sensitive to ident plus as a matter of being listed in the vocabulary. And this is the case of bound stems. But ident plus can also be marked on an exponent that's not listed as such due to operations in the grammar, namely host mapping and local host identification. So again, the interim summary gives us the general abstract representation of a vocabulary item from 20 repeated here. Okay. Oleg, when do you want me to shut up?
Sergey Georgievich, what do you think? Do we have any specific restrictions?
Ash, how much time do you think you need?
15 minutes?
Yeah, fine, perfect.
Great.
Okay. Just perfect.
Okay, thanks.
We are targeting to an hour and a half in total, including questions and discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so LrFG posits a constraint called most specific on the expression of phonological information, in other words, morphophonology. And most specific takes two exponents V structures. Oops, this should be not the words alpha and beta, but actually alpha and beta, and returns whichever exponent has the most restrictions on its phonological context. So the intuition behind most specific is to prefer affixes over otherwise compatible clitics or free forms, and to prefer clitics over otherwise compatible free forms. So in other words, we get the following preference order. Affixes are preferred over clitics, which are preferred over free forms. In terms of information encoded in vocabulary items, choose the VI whose output V structure contains more information, in other words, more features. Now, there are countervailing principles in the theory, which is a family of constraints called most informative. So most specific is not just running the show, but since most informative is about sort of different stuff, I'm not talking about it here. In terms of information encoded in vocabulary items, choose the VI whose output V structure contains more information, so more features. So for example, if English comparative and affix and more a free form are in competition, which they are by hypothesis in many DM treatments, then most specific will select But of course, there are situations in which is impossible, and then we have effectively the emergence of the unmarked. More pops out in those situations. Similarly, if English verbal inflection, for example, z and does are in competition, then most specific will select z, except in those contexts where it's impossible, in which case, again, the unmarked thing does pops out. Okay, so this is captured formally using the proper subsumption relation on V structures. So this is the formal definition. So the most specific constraint is formalized as a function that takes two exponents, two V structures as arguments, and returns whichever exponent contains the most information using restriction to set aside fon rep. So we don't want, obviously, fon rep to sort of make it fail because things in general won't have the same fon rep. There'll be different forms, in other words, right? Like more and have different fon reps, more and So if neither candidate contains more information than the other, or they contain information that's incompatible with each other, the constraint returns falsum, meaning that neither candidate is better than the other with respect to this constraint. Okay. So now together, this notion of dependence and identity give us a way of classifying forms formally. So I seek to demonstrate how the particular features dep and ident plus can be used to form a factorial typology over types of exponents. So the kinds of exponents that are of key interest for the typology are those for free forms, simple clitics, and affixes. So in LrFG, free forms are exponents that have the following features with any value. So they have a fon rep and a prosodic frame. Thus, free forms only specify their basic phonological features, in particular their underlying phonological form and any constraints on their prosodic context, which in general are not any, right? But there could be free forms that have some restrictions on their prosodic context. So adding features to this further constrains the exponent. The first added feature is dep, whose addition yields simple clitics or leaners. We arbitrarily call these clitic A. So these clitics have the features in 36 plus the dep feature. For example, the English possessive z and auxiliary l are specified as dep left because they lean on the preceding element. We assume on general grounds that z is the exponent of the category D and that l is the exponent of the category T. So we see examples from English in 38 and 39. As you can see, leaners are not fussy about the category of the element that they attach to. For example, in 38a, the leaner attaches to a noun, as is expected of a genitive marker, but in 38b, it attaches to a preposition, and in 38c to a verb. Note that z always happens to lean on a DP, but this is because there's always a DP in its specifier. In contrast, O is not always preceded by DP. For example, it can be preceded by VP, provided the VP is the subject of the sentence. To arrive on time will always bring you happiness. Perfectly pronounceable in English. The key thing to note is that the particular element at the right edge varies, and it's this element that is what the clitic's phonological form depends on. For example, it determines voicing assimilation. The cat's meow versus the car you're in's fender. Okay? So since the word clitic is ambiguous throughout the literature, we want to further distinguish these simple clitics from two other kinds, which we call respectively phonological clitics and syntactic clitics. Turning first to the phonological ones, these are a kind of clitic whose dependence properties are not determined by V structure, but rather just by their phonology. We arbitrarily call these clitic B. For example, in the Franz Planck example, which has been talked about a lot in the LrFG literature, drink a pint of milk, the prosodic constituency is drinka, pinta, milk, which is obviously not the syntactic constituency, right? The syntactic constituency would be drink a pint of milk, but that's not how you say it. Okay. So the phonological dependence of these examples is entirely a product of prosodic structure, 1, footing together drink and the reduced form of the indefinite determiner a, and 2, footing together pint and the reduced form of the preposition of, which both happen to just be schwas in English. In other words, this kind of prosodic phrasing is captured in prosodic structure and simply arises from the fact that the relevant functional words in this case have schwa allomorphs. So therefore, the clitic B variety, in fact, does not have a depth feature in V structure at all because its surface dependence is no more lexically conditioned than the surface dependence of drink or pint, the free forms. Thus, the V structure template for clitic B is identical to the one for free forms in 36 above. Next, let's turn to the third class, which we arbitrarily call clitic C. And notice that here we don't make reference to special clitics. We avoid this term because it tends to mean somewhat different things in different circles. We rather call these syntactic clitics, and we define them as those elements that are associated with a clitic-specific syntactic category, such as cl in the C structure. So this differentiates syntactic clitics from simple clitics, clitic A above. Okay. Indeed, elements of category cl can be freestanding, affixal, or simple clitics leaners depending on their V structure properties. For example, this is how we would treat Romance object clitics. So in Spanish, me lo dan, they give it to me. We generate the clitic cluster using the rule in 42, and so we have things like structures like 43. Okay. This is also how we've treated certain Ojibwe agreement clitics in the past. Okay, so recall that leaners or clitic A arise from adding the feature dep to the freeform features. Affixes arise from the combination of some dep value and ident plus. So these exponents have the following features, but note that the only possible value for ident is plus. So in other words, on top of the structure for clitics, an affix adds host ident plus, at least. So the use of dep and ident plus in classifying forms yields a factorial typology of major morphological kinds, as shown in table 1. So basically, affixes are things that are positively, that have some value for dep and have ident plus. Leaners or simple clitics are dependent, but they don't have ident plus. Free forms neither have ident plus nor dep. And phonological clitics and syntactic clitics, although they're not free forms in the sort of pre-theoretical sense, are represented the same way in the theory. And lastly, by speculation, we might infer that, okay, there's this missing cell, this grayed out cell here. So something that might have ident plus, like need a host, but not be actually prosodically dependent, would be some particles and some prepositions in English, for example. So now let's look at an example. So this is a pretty gory example, right? But I'm going to go through it. So this un suffix occurs in words such as blacken, quicken, and soften. So let's talk about why all this information is here. The suffix is simultaneously both very productive and quite restrictive, right? So it's kind of a sub-regular suffix or something like that, if you want to call it that. It has many prosodic, phonological, and morphosyntactic restrictions on its host. It also places morphosemantic restrictions on the result of combinations with this host, such that the host must be a property of events or entities. We capture this through semantic typing. However, if the full set of constraints is satisfied, the affix arises very productively. We base the morphophonological and morphosyntactic constraints on the analysis of Halley 73. So the host is monosyllabic and ends in an obstruent, optionally preceded by a sonorant. According to Halley, this is a well-formedness condition on the output, which is why soften and hasten are allowed, since the underlying T is deleted in these contexts. Okay. So now let's go through each of the affix's properties and how we capture them. With respect to its prosody and morphophonology, this affix is consistently pronounced as a syllable with a reduced vowel and an alveolar nasal coda. So its fon rep is un. Okay. The affix is a syllable that is the last in its foot. So its P frame value looks like this. That says, you know, its prosodic correspondent is in a syllable, and that syllable is the final syllable in a foot. The affix's form is subject to local word level phonotactics. Therefore, its P domain value is the word. With respect to dependency, the affix is a suffix, which means it's dependent to it. It is dependent to its left. Therefore, its dep value is LT, short for the singleton set LT. We also have included the feature class in the V structure, really just for illustration, because at this point, synchronically, English probably just has regular and irregular verbs. It doesn't really have verb classes anymore, even though it did historically. I'll let you read that on its own. And then it has conditions on its host. So first of all, the affix pre-theoretically lowers to the head of the complement of the affix. So it contains the feature host ident plus. So we capture this directly through the interplay of host ident plus and dep left. The output form of the host must be no longer than one syllable. This is one of Halley's prosodic restrictions. And the host must also end in an obstruent. And lastly, the affix is a deadjectivizing verbalizer. So as is common in distributed morphology, we assume multiple subvarieties of categories, such as subvarieties of little v. The fact that n is deadjectivizing is a consequence of C-structural head adjunction of little a to the particular little v that n is the exponent of. So the use of adjunction allows the selectional history to be transmitted through the C structure. So this actually replaces a feature we had in older speculative versions of the theory called type, but we don't think we need it with this kind of approach. So in terms of its formal analysis, since this isn't really a core LrFG analysis, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but LrFG assumes that the V correspondence is defined and constrained by a description, which we call a V description. And so the V description for N would look like something like this, okay? But you can think of it as just defining a structure. Note that the reordering of the affix and host happens at prosodic structure via the prosodic correspondence function. So a sketch of the LrFG C structure with additional row mappings is shown in 50. The less marked alternative is a zero marked form. And since LrFG does not employ zero affixes, how do we do this? Well, zero marking is a result of the fact that Pac-Man spanning is always available when a vert exponence otherwise fails. Now, we have a formal way of capturing this, but I thought it would overload the talk to put this in. So, we have forms like with n affixation, like to redden, to blacken, and then we have forms that use Pac-Man spanning. So you can't brownen or orangen or yellowen in English. You have to just orange, yellow, and brown things. So here are some actual examples, constructed, but not bizarre. Okay, so the maple leaves yellowed, reddened, and finally browned in the sun, right? Not the maple leaves yellowened, reddened, and finally browned in the sun. So now let's talk a little bit about the mapping to prosody, and then I'll give you the big reveal, and I'll be done, okay? So the essence of our morphological analysis of Blacken is captured by 45 and 50 above, but let's talk about it in sort of more precise terms. So first recall the mapping principle in 24. So given 24, the row mapping must be as in 53, where the P structure is represented as one of Tina Bogel's P structures. Okay, so this thing is a representation of prosody, phonology. Okay, and we see that these the V structure for black is the host, but it can't bring along its host if it had one. It doesn't, but it can't, okay? Because the local host identification. And then we see all these bits of structure mapping to the P structure. Now, we can talk about exactly what's happening here in more detail, but the point is the theory actually explicitly states what the mapping is from morphology to prosody and captures the prosody and the phonology. So, Figure 2 on the next page shows what we call an everything everywhere all at once diagram for Blacken. Note that this thing, this train wreck of vowels is probably most easily pronounced as dubby, dub-a-o. Okay, unless you really want to say e-e-a-a-o, which hurts my feelings. So a WAO diagram simultaneously represents the C structure, V structure, P structure, F structure, S structure mappings and glue proofs for an expression. It's a strength of the fully constraint-based ethos of LrFG that one can simultaneously represent multiple kinds of grammatical information and how the different kinds of information relate to each other. So without further ado, here is the diagram. So there's a lot going on here, right? We have the C structure. We have the F structure, which isn't anything very interesting for blacken. It's just the pred black. And then we have a semantic structure, which has this thing that we call an eventity argument because it can be an event or an entity. Okay. And then we have this structure here. And notice that these things also have, obviously every node has an exponent, an exponendum. So this thing here is saying that, okay, black's a root, it contributes a pred, and it's just a property over eventities, whatever those are. Okay. Now this adjectivizer says, oh no, I can take an eventity thing, but I'm going to turn it into a property of entities. That's what adjectives do. And then the verbalizer comes along and says, okay, yeah, I can take an adjectival property, but I'm going to turn it into a property of events. And I'm also going to add this information about cause and become to it. Okay. This is just what I showed you before. So this is all the upper path in the architecture mappings. And this is the glue proof that shows that for this thing, we derive, for blacken specifically, we derive cause to become black as the interpretation. Okay. So sorry, I've gone slightly over, Sergey, but I've shown how an LrFG, an exponent, is a vocabulary structure that's V-mapped from an exponendum. The exponendum is the left-hand side and the exponent is the right-hand side of a vocabulary item, a listed mapping in the vocabulary. The overall mapping thus looks like this for any language L. An exponendum is V-mapped to an exponent, and that thing is mapped by, what is this? The composition of the prosodic mapping and the phonological mapping maps the exponent to a realization. So importantly, this demonstrates that exponents and realization are not conflated in LrFG. Exponents is about the mapping from C structure to V structure as conditioned by the vocabulary. Realization is about the mapping from V structure to prosody, it's bad prosody, to prosody and phonology. In other words, exponents concerns part of the morphology, prosody, phonology path in the architecture, namely the morphological interface between syntax and form that is represented by V structure, whereas realization concerns the rest of the MPP path, the prosody interfaces between morphology and the row interface between morphology and prosody, and the O interface between prosody and phonology. Lastly, we think it's a strength of the LrFG framework that we can represent the various structures and the interfaces between them simultaneously, as in the everything everywhere all at once diagram in figure 2. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, in my opinion, very enlightening and detailed talk. And I think this is the most detailed explanation of LrFG that I have heard personally. So I think we can all study it for a long time, the handout and the recording. Does anyone do we have any questions in the chat, among the participants? I see that Dmitry has a question, so maybe Dmitry, you can ask your question, please. Go on.
The simpler question is about various kinds of autosegmental structures. Like you say that the phonological exponent is a string. Is it just an abstraction, or is there some deliberate reason you exclude Goldsmith-style autosegmental structure?
Well, so we actually don't ignore it, because if you see in this diagram, there's this ellipsis. So other kinds of representational levels can be encoded in these diagrams. And this diagram is already, if you think about it, almost an autosegmental kind of diagram. It shows segments, but it shows their properties as well at other tiers, right? So here we have sort of a mapping, for example, between this syllable and this V index, which is picking out this much of the phonology. And then we have a mapping from this syllable to this guy, which is picking out the un. So I think if we wanted to add things like tone and things like that for a tonal language, we would add a different tier and have different mappings between the prosody and so forth. So I think, in a sense, Tina's P structures already are kind of a pseudo autosegmental representation. So I don't see any problems in principle of adding that, although we haven't worked on a language where it's been necessary to add one yet.
Yeah, I see. And the second question, does the reference to spanning and the discussion around it basically entail that you abandon terminal spell out of standard distributed morphology and go with something like merchant spans and then a syntax phrasal spell out? Like...
No, well, we don't have anything like phases for sure. Okay, let me try to unpack your question. So, no, I don't think so. I mean, the thing to kind of bear in mind about LrFG is that I haven't explained one of these lines here, and this is something that Dan and I are working on now. What's going on here? So this is the thing I call the omega mapping, right? So actually, the C structure proper ends here. So the terminal nodes are just these nodes that are labeled with some category. And then these can, through a process that you can think of as something like lexical insertion, are related to these exponenda, right? Now, by thinking about this as another mapping, which I've called omega here, we can think about what the properties of this mapping are. So maybe the ideal property is a one-to-one terminal spell out, and we can capture that ideal. But in fact, languages often miss that ideal, right? For reasons basically of diachronic change. So I'm not sure if we can quite have our cake and eat it too, but I think we can say something interesting about terminal spell out. You don't look 100% satisfied, but I don't know if I can do better.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's just you basically tiptoe the question of fusion in that way too, and so yeah. So yeah, I think
yeah. I mean, we actually have a very explicit trigger for Pac-Man spanning, which is when some node has just been left unexponed, right? And there's a way to sort of formally capture that trigger, but what we don't want is to be backed into a position where we have to take structures apart again, as in some operations in traditional distributed morphology. So fusion's fine, but fission is crazy, in my opinion. So, that's just my opinion. I think language in general doesn't do this thing where it puts things together and then takes them apart again.
Yes.
Okay, I think there are some more questions from the participants. So if we have time left, we can return to this question. So Peter Arkadiev has a question. Please, Peter, could you?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ash. It was really enlightening, although also challenging. And I think that my question is related and probably too stupid to understand all the details of the theoretical machinery of this level of complexity. So I have a I think it's a clarification question. So it relates to your pages 22 and 23, and specifically your way to deal with the clitics of the third kind. So with respect to this, to table one, I'm afraid I probably, not probably, just didn't understand the ident plus thing. Therefore, I don't understand how so-called syntactic clitics end up with free forms. And in relation to this, it's probably more of an empirical question on the previous page. So you sort of a priori consider the so-called Romance, the Romance object markers as clitics. But are they really clitics? They only occur with verbs. So they are affixes according to, well, most definitions of affixes, and why they are treated as clitics is just a matter of tradition, orthography, whatever. And of course, I don't really understand why Ojibwe agreement affixes, as well as many agreement affixes in other languages, are often called clitics by theoretical linguists, although these markers are also clearly affixes. And I think it's this kind of sloppy theoretical sloppiness doesn't do us good.
Okay, thanks. So I think if I understood, there's basically two questions, and neither one of them is stupid, by the way. So let me take the first question first, okay? So it was, why do we label these things with free forms? I mean, there's a sort of simple theoretical answer, which is that there's no exponential, I don't know what the right word is here. There's no difference in the representation of the exponents from free forms. So they're clitic-like properties. And again, we can argue about whether they are clitic-like or affix-like. That's going to be the second answer. Are not due to morphological criteria or morphophonological criteria, but rather they are just things that act pre-theoretically like other things that we call clitics. Okay. Now, going back to your point about affixes and clitics, yeah, I completely agree. These could be affixes, right? But the fact is that the Romance things, whatever they are, in the imperative flip to the other side of the verb, okay? And that's, you know, kind of, at least by my sort of upbringing, kind of a weird thing for affixes to do.
It's
now
not.
You could say, sorry?
It's not. Sorry, it's not. I recently started working on this kind of on morphemes that behave in this way, the so-called ambifixes, and they are found in quite a lot of languages, and some of them also occur word internally, not at the edges. So it's we have to live with the fact that there are affixes that can occur on either side of their roots.
Yeah, I mean, I would be fine with that. I'm not wed to this analysis, but of Spanish. But the point is, if there is a language where these things are clearly not affixes, there could be a language that has these clitic clusters or whatever, and those would be syntactic clitics. Whether Romance clitics are actually instances of these is a slightly different question, right? So we're just kind of looking at the landscape of things people have said and how our sort of theory traverses that landscape, for lack of a better term, right? I'm not saying the landscape is right. I'm just saying this is what we've been given. And so what do we have to say about it? So I didn't mean to implicitly endorse this analysis necessarily. It's one possible analysis. Affixes are definitely another possible analysis. I personally think the evidence for the affixal nature of clitics in Romance is stronger for French than it is for Spanish. But you know, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. May I chime in by saying that actually I think that in this framework you don't actually have affixes and clitics as basic concepts. You have them in this, like in table 1, they're kind of labels for the cells in this table, and we might actually argue that our understanding on affixes and clitics is different from the traditional understanding, and we could actually use this to enlighten us as to how to classify different elements. So I think kind of the discussion of whether Romance clitics, well, so-called clitics, are affixes or clitics based on the traditional or typological perspective might give different answers, as opposed to if we approach it from the LrFG point of view and try to actually understand how this framework understands affixes and clitics. Because that's
if I can just pick up on your point for a second, like, yeah, these are basically the 4 possibilities we get, and we've tried to say something like, okay, what are these possibilities in terms of like what people talk about, but you know, we don't ultimately want to have a nomenclature fight about, you know, do I really want to call this thing an affix or do I really want to call this thing a clitic? It's the thing that is positively specified for dep and ident, you know, or it's the thing that's positively specified for dep but not specified for ident, and so on. So, you know, this is part of the reason why we made up these things, clitic A, clitic B, clitic C. But you've made a good point, Peter, which is just even the distinction between affixes and clitics is also fraught from a typological and sort of language data perspective, as well as a theoretical perspective.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I have another. Actually, I have several questions, but I think they can all be kind of condensed. I mean, we can discuss them for hours and hours, but we don't have actually that much time, and I don't want to tire the audience. But I think they all can be all unified by a general, maybe it's not a problem, but observation that kind of on the one hand, it's a great feature of phonology that you have this modularity, that you can look at mismatches and so on. But on the other hand, if you have complex generatives, well, whatever, if you have complex autonomous systems which can model stuff at different levels, you also have kind of redundancy of these levels, where you can do the same thing in different ways. And then it's not always clear how what way exactly you have to choose in your analysis. It gives you too many analytical options. So, for example, one thing which occurred to me is that actually if we have the feature dep in exponents, then what does the head ordering in the C structure do? If we can have a preceding head which is a suffix, or a following head which is a prefix, then maybe we should just abandon this feature at C structure and say that C structure only represents embedding but doesn't represent order, and the ordering comes from the dep feature. Or we can say do the other way around and say that the ordering goes from the C structure, and if you have kind of 2 affixes with different orders, it actually means they are found in different heads. I mean, probably not, especially given what Peter said about ambifixes, which are so widespread, but I mean, this gives us 2 different levels at which we can define linear order. Similarly, another feature which I think is it makes a huge difference with DM is that DM assumes basically that you have a scaffold which is universal across languages. We have this hierarchy of projections which are always found in the same places. And that's why you need, you have the problem of skipping over adjuncts or specifiers, because, for example, you have a tense head at the top of the tree, and you have the V, which is somewhere below, and between this tense and the V, there is some arguments, and you want the tense head, the affix for tense, to jump on the verb, right? But in LrFG, you don't technically have this problem, because you can put this stuff under V, right? You can put this, I mean, that's not actually allowed by the current version of X-bar theory, but I think, at least my understanding is that LrFG, you want to allow this. You want to say that sometimes the structure, the syntax is all under V0. That's what some analysis do. Like some of your analysis and what I did during this last LrFG conference. So you basically say there is the verb, and under the verb you have all these tense piece, aspect piece, and so on, which is all happening below the X0 level. And in this case, you don't actually need to jump, right? And you can actually use the lack of, let's say, group fixation or clitic status of these things as an argument in favor of saying they are all attached very low in the tree rather than high, right? At least in LrFG, you can do this, right? You can say that the order of projections is language specific. You don't have to say that it's universal. And Similarly, well, a bit differently, but still kind of related note, I think, is that, okay, so you have this locality of host, which is in DM very important, because in DM you want, there's a lot of importance given to the fact that you can't inherit stuff jumping over heads, right? It has to be adjacent. But in LrFG, we can always circumvent this by just putting stuff into F structure. So we can say that inflection class is an F structure feature, which is realized by some affixes. I mean, of course, this is not nice, this is not pretty, but I mean, technically we can do it. So I think we also need some theory which says which features can be found in F structure and which features can be found in V structure, which features are in C structure actually, because you have this analysis of the adjectivizer, which also verbalizer, which also puts this A subscript, which is kind of also a C structure feature. So I think we, if we use this, we also need an elaborate theory for saying what we can do or what we can't do. Otherwise, we will have too many options. And I hope I'm clear enough.
Okay. You said a lot. Let me answer some of it. So on the question of dependency versus head marking, or sorry, head ordering or whatever, right? It's true that in LFG you can just let heads be on wherever they appear, like seem to be from the signal, basically, right? But there's two reasons why we do it this way. One is that the head position is where the unmarked thing shows up. So that's the thing that determines why the thing is on which direction, on which side of whatever it is. And also it allows us to maintain a more consistent notion of head ordering. Like it allows us to say English is really a head first language, despite some things that make it look like it's a mixed head first, head final language, right? And so there's a kind of mental hygiene that comes with that. But really the first consideration is more important to us. Then about your point about features and where they belong and stuff, yeah, that's true. And what I would say is, I don't have a broad theory of it, but I have a rule of thumb, which is that, for example, a feature should only go in F structure if something somewhere has to talk about it, right? So if it is related to F structural information, like if things are sensitive to it that are represented at F structure, then sure, put it in F structure. That's why inflectional class is a terrible suggestion for F structure, because nothing in F structure cares about that. So it's true that when you have this highly modular architecture, you need sort of sub-theories of like, what is this module representing and what's information is appropriate to it, right? But on the other hand, if you don't have that, if you have a theory like minimalism or maybe even HPSG, where you have these undifferentiated big structures, then it can be really easy to not exercise mental hygiene in like what features you propose, what feature checking there is. There can be a lot of sort of arbitrariness in a way that you kind of avoid with modularity. Yes, you're left with this analytical problem you mentioned, but where you put things isn't really arbitrary, right? And so it lets each structure be kind of simpler in its own right while multiplying structures. And so the question is, is that overall a simpler theory or not? I don't know. Maybe it's something like John Goldsmith's minimal description length, which I think he talked to your department about last year, might help us sort out things like that. But it's not easy just at that level to say many modules that are simpler is worse than one module that's complex, or vice versa, right? You need to actually dig into their properties to make that statement have teeth.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good point. I'm not saying it's better. I'm just saying that it's a challenge for the LrFG community to formulate sub-theories. Because if we look at what people are doing in actual implemented grammars, like Pargram, they're putting all sorts of stuff into F structure. I mean, semantic features, morphosyntactic features, whatever. So I think we should really come to grips with this reality and try to do something with it. But
let me just make a quick comment about that. Let me just make a quick comment about that. So Pargram shouldn't be the standard that we judge LrFG theory by, because so Pargram is the Parallel Grammars project for anyone who doesn't know about it, and it's based on the Xerox linguistic environment, or Xerox language environment. I forget what the L stands for. It's something about language, which is like a development sort of system for LFG grammars. But it's coded such that the thing only really understands C structures and F structures. You can't really add other modules to it except by sort of faking them. So the fact that people put, it's one of those, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So their only tool is kind of F structure, so everything looks like an F structure feature. But it's because they've had their hands hands tied by the implementation, not because they're proposing that in a quote unquote serious way necessarily.
Yeah, that's true as well, but still something to think about in the future when the
yeah. No, I think this is important. I mean, like, this is my own work about moving argument structure to semantic structure.
Exactly.
Is a version of this. It's like, well, we don't really need a separate level of argument structure once we sort of get this connected semantic structure, and now we can
do arguments from the preds as well.
Right, and so you can think about what belongs in there, right? So a simplification in F structure is accomplished by moving information to semantic structure. But you need that information somewhere, so you haven't achieved the global simplification, really. Right. Yeah,
I guess that's what I think Jackendorf used the term honest accounting to describe different theories. Like, you have to be serious about representing the information rather than saying, okay, we're not dealing with this, it is somewhere in semantics, and we don't do semantics, we do syntax, so we just don't care about this stuff, we put it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, without characterizing people, I think what you don't want to do is sort of be a sleight of hand artist. Like, now you see it, now you don't. Like, tell people like what you mean and let them attack it or discuss it or whatever, but telling them involves being explicit, even if it's kind of gory for a presentation. I mean, I think Peter's point is very valid. This was a gory presentation, but part of it is to assure you that we've been working on the details, and it's not just like this plus EPP feature maps to this or something. And it's like, well, that's not very satisfying because it's not a real explanation or a real representation.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, that's for me, it was always a very strong argument in favor of LrFG, and I hope that we had some people convinced, or at least interested enough to dig deeper into this. And thank you very much for this very intellectually stimulating talk. And I think we're out of time for questions. If there is anyone who would like to ask something very small, I guess we can have this time. Otherwise, thank you again, Ash, and thank you for coming. Thank you for this detailed talk, and I hope that we will see more elaborate developments of this theory later on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'll send Oleg a corrected version of the handout and post it on the LrFG site as well. So I'll just clean it up a bit, and you can have a maybe slightly easier version to read.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.